Namaste, my name is Amish Tripathi and I'm the director of the Nehru Center, London. Now, some may think of Nehru Center as just this beautiful fine building, and it is a fine building, no doubt. We have a wonderful art gallery out here. We have an awesome auditorium on the first floor with a capacity of 100 to 120 people right here in the heart of central London in Mayfair. But the Nehru Center is a lot more than this fine building. The Nehru Center is also an online platform. We are available on Twitter, on Facebook, on Instagram and on YouTube. And so the Nehru Center is actually wherever you want it to be. Of course, we'd love for you to come to the physical events that we organize out here when we do organize them. But do join all our online platforms as well. This is a hybrid world. We are going to have offline physical events and online events as well. So do join our online platforms and do keep giving us feedback of what you think of it. We'd love to host you out there. We'd love to hear what you think of our events, and do keep sending in your suggestions as well. We do keep imbibing and learning from the feedback that you give to us to give you programs that you guys might enjoy. Thank you so much for your kind attention. Namaste. Jai Hind.
Good evening and good morning, because there are people who are joining us both from London and of course very much over here in India. Today is actually what we celebrate as Children's Day, or the Nehru Centenary over here. And I think the best day possible to have a discussion on a book which has been released and written by two of the brightest, I would say, and I know them very personally. It's Mr. Adeel Hussain. He is one of the writers, co-authors of the book. The book, of course, is The Debates That Have Defined India. So there's Adeel Hussain, who's just going to join us in a short while from now from London. And we also have Tripurdaman Singh, who's going to join us again from London. First of all, my many congratulations to both of you for the book. Very timely, something which is the focus of the debate and the political narrative over here in India, you know, because I cover politics and, you know, whether it's parliament, it's outside parliament, you know, for better or for worse, Nehru suddenly has made a comeback. He's no longer a part of history or India's freedom struggle. He's a part of today's political narrative. And it's interesting, like on a day like today, I'm just going to give you a brief backdrop. Normally what happens is whenever there are these Nehru centenaries or any important centenary, there's a little kind of an event is held inside Parliament of India. There's much politics which has happened over Nehru over here also, because at the garlanding of the Nehru statue, which is inside the Indian Parliament, the opposition parties, which is the Congress plus the Trinamool Congress specifically, claims that no minister turned up from the government. So much for not respecting Nehru. And in fact, I was looking at Swapan Dasgupta's forward, and I'm hoping that he's going to join us soon. He's the one who's actually going to do the e-release of the book. He, in fact, in his forward does mention the fact that there has been a lot of polarization with Nehru actually being there at the epicenter. So I'm just waiting for Mr. Swapan Dasgupta to join us. He's going to do an e-release of the book. Oh, there he is. Thank you so much, Swapan, for joining us. I hope your net issues are sorted out. But before we go ahead with the schedule, if Swapan, you can hear us, we would like to request you for an e-release of this book, which has been written by both Tripurdaman as well as Adeel Hussain. Okay, we seem to have lost him once again. But I mean, I'm just going to wait for him to join us. I think we're just going to try and get lucky that he can actually do the e-launch of the book. But I have to ask you this basic question. Why did you think of writing a book on Nehru? Both of you, actually, one by one, if you could respond.
I mean, maybe I'll just jump in first. So thank you so much, Pallavi, for having us, and thank you so much for giving these kind introductions. So the original reason for writing this book may have been to launch it at the Nehru Center itself, because now that I've seen the venue in the trailer, I'm just amazed by the premises, and I had no idea that they had such an elaborate architecture in Mayfair. So part of the reason of why we wrote this book is because Nehru began a series of debates with leading Indian intellectuals and politicians that still remain contested to this day. And partly of what we wanted to do was to bring the debate back to its origins. Because as you know, debates after a century, they tend to transmute and transform and take very different shapes and forms. And what we wanted to do here was to say that this is how Nehru originally engaged with them. And what that tells us is, for instance, what Nehru's constitutional moves were when he was thinking about how to bring about a democratic constitution for the Indian Republic. And that debate is, of course, important because lawyers engage with it in order to determine on where to stand on many of these points. But beyond the law, what we also wanted to do was just to provide like a glimpse into an era of Indian politics, both pre-colonial, so when the Congress Party was still rubbing against the Muslim League, and post-colonial, when Nehru was trying to define specific foreign policy and non-alignment and everything that came with it.
Okay, yeah, go ahead. I'm going to wait for Mr. Swapan Dasgupta because we seem to be having him in and out. Yeah, Tripurdaman, it's interesting because the book also talks about, socialism. This is something which I would love to ask Mr. Swapan Dasgupta when he joins us. You talk about him in the context of, say, the communalism or his relationship with Iqbal. You also talk about, I can see the exchange of letters between Jawaharlal Nehru and Sardar Patel. So whether it's nationalism. Okay, Swapan has joined us. Thank you very much, Swapan. Can you hear us over here? Can you hear us, Swapan? Yeah, you go ahead. So the book talks about the many facets of Nehru, and the fact that we are talking in a different genre, we are talking in a different. Many of the young people of India today perhaps don't even know what Nehru was all about. Perhaps from his last the Tryst with Destiny speech, that's about it. But he's often seen to be an architect of something which has gone either horribly wrong, as many in the BJP point out, or which laid the edifice of our socialism, of our national security policy, of our foreign policy. You dwell a lot of that in the book.
And all of that is also really important. As you mentioned, a lot of people don't really know what Nehru was about, and even when we do look at him, we look at him through the prism of current day debates, and that's one of the things we really wanted to kind of cut through. We want to let Nehru really speak for himself, and that's one of the things I think this book does is let Nehru speak for himself and kind of take away a lot of the extra kind of baggage that he has accumulated, and I think that's where I'm really coming from.
And maybe I can just add to that, because you mentioned Nehru's socialism. So part of the appeal that a book that historicizes Nehru's ideas, of course, has is that he puts it in context. Like, Nehru's socialism was a disaster. It was a disaster for India. It did not bode well. It created a top-down state that wasn't very much conducive from benefiting of the capitalist expansion that many other countries did in the latter part of the 20th century. But if we start thinking about Nehru's socialism in the context of what capitalism means, and then what capitalism means for the West and what it means for India, then it comes with very different promises. So for the West, capitalism came with the promise of liberty, regardless of how incompletely it was able to distribute that, but it came with the promise of wealth and liberty and that generally humankind would march into a direction of progress. Now, in India, capitalism came with the East India Company. That wasn't a promise of liberty. So for an Indian politician who, comes of age in the early 20th century, it was very much to be expected that he would associate everything that capitalism stands for and everything that capitalist modernity stands for as something, or at least the economic system of capitalism, is something that he would fight and he would want to fight. Even though, of course, Nehru kept alive the promise of modernity. Hence, we have, or India has all of these institutions that reflect that. But in general, Nehru's socialism is something that was widely prevalent at the time amongst an entire generation of nationalist leaders.
Or is it that, given as the time that he was living in, and the fact that India had just got independence and he played a key role in that, he perhaps was left with no choice but then to be a socialist? Because as you pointed out, that going in for a capitalist path meant that you would be identified too much with the negativity of the British rule. But over time, you also had to change. And I like that line which was there in the book, which says that he was so much into socialism that it went against nationalism. So if today there are problems of nationalism which India is facing, the genesis of it is perhaps in the deeply socialist values and philosophy of Nehru. And very quickly, I would also like to add, this is something which I think his daughter Indira Gandhi also picked up initially. She talked about socialism, but that was also believed to have been undoing initially of her tenure as prime minister, and she had to change track. She had to opt for liberalization, which in a sense, I think Rajiv Gandhi was smarter and did understand it easily, that, you had to go in for a so-called non-socialist path, which is not such a bad thing.
No, you're absolutely right, and it's important to remember also that Nehru was not just a socialist; he was also an internationalist. So for him, and a committed anti-imperialist. So for him, all of these three things are very closely intertwined, and you saw that not just domestically but you also saw that in his foreign policy, because it was sort of laced with the themes of internationalism and anti-imperialism, for which he was very willing, to a large extent, some might say, or others might say that actually India's national interest was in the promotion of international socialism and anti-imperialism. So they came as a sort of package deal, and he couldn't quite separate one from the other, and I think this is kind of something that you pick up on through some of the chapters in the book. He couldn't separate these few strands, and so for him, his commitment to anti-imperialism, which meant support for the sort of then communist movements in Southeast Asia, was as much, he also saw in it both promotion of international socialism as well as what he might think of as the promotion of India's national interest. Now, whether that was really India's national interest or not, that's that remains a matter of debate. I mean, I would fall on the other side and say no, but
absolutely. I don't know. I'm still trying to connect with Mr. Swapan Dasgupta.
Yeah, I'm all there. I'm here.
Okay, you're all there. I can hear you. I can't see you, but we really need to get you in at this point of time. Hopefully, the video also joins us. So we have to put up with this. As I told you, there's a net problem, but it's nice to hear Swapan, even if we don't get to see him. Swapan, first of all, we would really want to have that launch of the book. So we're going to do an e-release of the book. I don't know how we do it minus seeing your face, but that's possible, right? So we can go ahead, Swapan, if you can just formally release the book, which has been written by both Adeel as well as Tripurdaman.
I don't know whether you can see me. I don't know why this inexplicable problem has arisen. But anyway, I've got the book in my hand, and I'm very glad to. I read a typescript of it, or a PDF copy of it, and now I've got a copy in my hand. If you can raise a copy, I think others who can see it will probably benefit from that. And
I don't have a hard copy. The authors can show the copy.
To do the
yes,
same.
The authors, please go ahead and show your copy. Yeah.
There we go.
Okay, Swapan, finally you released the book and I can get to see you also. So great for
thank
joining
you very
us.
much. My apologies.
Swapan, we
all
have been chit-chat. No, we understand. Swapan, we've been chit-chatting, but we were really dying to listen to you. Okay, so I was looking at your foreword. I liked what you write because this is so true. This is exactly what we were talking about. You made a reference to the kind of polarization which has now got associated with Nehru. I know the party which you belong from often gets into loggerheads with the Congress party because Congress feels, look, you're rubbishing our legacy and you don't respect the Nehru Gandhis. You have an opposition to Nehru for the heck of it. The BJP's argument, as you know, is very different. And let's be kind of above politics in this. The fact is that many of the policies of Nehru, some of the best political experts do concede, is because he perhaps did not understand that tilting too much in favor of socialism for a new nation or a new country perhaps could have important repercussions in the future. How much would you say of today's issues, whether it's national security issue, whether it's a secularism issue, nationalism as such, does have its genesis in the Nehruvian legacy, so to say?
Well, a lot of what we in India have inherited owes considerably to the Nehruvian legacy, at least independent India, an India which is 70 years down the line. But at the same time, may I just make one qualification that, it's often not prudent or it's wise to reduce a scholarly book like this to a discussion between the Congress and the BJP. I think there is a lot of areas in which we can have independent positions, and I, being a student of history, would certainly, not like to associate with some of the more cruder critiques of Nehruvian India. But at the same time, then let's just get to some of the points which, say, for instance, Adeel and Tripurdaman were raising on the question of socialism.
Yes.
To what extent was Nehru's socialism motivated by fashion, contemporary fashion? I think to some extent it was. It was the spirit of the times. At least for Nehru, who in his sort of social demeanor was very much an upper class Englishman in various ways. And even if he didn't sort of embrace vegetarianism and some of the alternative lifestyles which were a feature of the 1930s socialist culture in Britain, he did take up some of those issues which mainly Lasky and others may have taken. Some of the more mainstream socialists did take up at this point. But it's important to note that insofar as his socialism was concerned, it was not a consensus within Indian nationalism at that time. I think that's a very important point which we must say, that Nehru certainly represented a strand, but it was by no means the only strand. The Congress had a very active policy of encouraging indigenous capitalism, Indian capitalism. Nehru stood apart from that. Even as late as 1948, when he was inaugurating the Vizag shipyards, which had been commissioned which had been set up by the Walchand Hirachand group, comments on that was really quite, if I might say so, a little obnoxious. Because here is one of the big landmark projects of independent India. He comes in and says, capitalists are basically bloodsuckers. In a very slightly more, in a more refined sort of way, but he says that. And he while we can appreciate that something like the Bombay Plan did speak a lot about the state having a say in the development of Indian industry, it by no means negated the role of the private sector. While Nehru, just like he had an abhorrence to anyone who was religious, also had a deep abhorrence towards anyone who was seen to be making money, although he liked money himself. I mean, his tastes were certainly refined and they don't come free. So you had these various contradictions of Nehru, very much the upper class Englishman who represented some of those quintessential traits. And I think if you look at the social attitudes of Nehru and you compare it to what existed in Britain at that time, I think you'll be able to understand him far more, even sympathize with the type of person he was. I think that's important to realize. And you must also realize that this was by no means the consensus in the rest of the country. Patel had a very different view. Rajendra Prasad had a different view. Subhash Bose was more of a mixed bag. He was a bit of a mixed bag. But I think we must realize that really what we call the Nehruvian consensus, and I think both Adeel and Tripurdaman are quite right in their book, that it was the death of Sardar Patel and his inability to present that memorandum and the point of dissent on India's China policy. His death marked the end of all resistance within the Congress to alternative strands, and it was there that it came about. So one thing we must be clear about our minds is Nehru was an important figure in the nationalist movement during the struggle, but he was by no means the only person. He was fighting, he was articulating certain trends, which were certainly present, but it was only after independence and the death of Sardar Patel and the ceremonial elevation of Dr. Rajendra Prasad, and to some extent, I think, the exit of Jinnah into another sphere altogether, which I think contributed to this. So I think put Nehru in that perspective. He was an important figure, but he was not by no means the only current in Indian nationalism.
And in the book, it's very interesting. Swapan, was a letter exchange which is there between Jawaharlal Nehru and Sardar Patel, and they were very open about the fact. And I remember the first two lines are very interesting, where Mr. Nehru tells Mr. Sardar Patel that, let's be open about the fact that we've had differences, and this is something which came up in front of Mahatma Gandhi as well. This brings me to a 1962 war, which is actually seen the book really has a lot of reference to it also. The 1962 war and the debacle which was faced by India thereon is all attributed to a very great extent to the so-called faulty policy of Jawaharlal Nehru. And in this political discourse which we talk about in present times, Swapan, often this topic comes up that if Sardar Patel had been the Prime Minister, perhaps things would have been different.
Well, I don't know. I mean, these are counterfactual questions, which we can never get a definitive answer. And it's always lovely game to actually speculate what if. I think there are two aspects of Nehru's foreign policy which comes across as far as the China incident is concerned. The first is an exaggerated romanticism. I think it was not limited to Nehru. I think Sardar Panikkar was more guilty than even Jawaharlal Nehru. That's the first one, whereby you believe that it's impossible for a socialist country to actually mount a war of aggression and fight over territory in which, to use Nehru's own words, not a blade of grass grows. That's the first one, the exaggerated romanticism, whereby he was unmindful and sometimes blind to some of the other realities which came up. And he believed that it was his historic, and this is something which the book brings out very well, that it is profound sense of Asianism, and whereby he wanted to be the sort of epitome of that thing. And China and India were the two big pillars of Asia. So he thought that really this is really the creation of an alternative world, and therefore China has to be taken along handheld in Bandung, etc., etc. That's the first, the romanticism of Jawaharlal Nehru. The second point which comes across from these letters of Sardar Patel and Jawaharlal Nehru is that there was a profound choice which India had to make in 1947. And I say this with, I know I might be pilloried for saying so, but there was a choice to be made. Are you creating a new India, or are you going to be the successor regime to the Raj? Now, here, India's China policy was a bit muddled. If you upheld the McMahon line, if you looked at India's traditional concessions in Tibet, then you are basically saying that, look, we are basically pursuing the gains of the young husband mission of 1905. But if you are saying, like China did, that we are tearing up the imperialist treaties, then it's a different matter altogether. And I think India went through that muddle. And I think there were large sections of the Indian establishment at that time. I would say Patel, without articulating it as such. Sir Girija Shankar Bajpai was another one who believed that broadly speaking, India must follow the old policies or the old foreign policies of the Raj, which incidentally were not made in Whitehall, but which were evolved from initially Calcutta and then subsequently Delhi. And it's this, I believe this fault line is often there in contemporary politics. I am an unabashed, an unapologetic admirer of Lord Curzon. And I believe he was really one of the earliest of the Indian nationalists. In the sense he looked at India as the central, as the pillar, and as the pivot on which the empire rested, and that India had an autonomy of its own. That was his battle with Kitchener, I mean, if you go back into history. So it was that fault line also which manifested itself as the question of Tibet, and whether you ally yourself with the West, whether you strike a non-aligned thing, or whether you tilt excessively towards the Soviet Union, all these questions which came up in the whole China episode. And I think the book is a very, very good introduction. And I think anybody who reads the book will obviously find a lot of parallels and a lot of relevance to what is happening in India and some of the subsequent debates, which actually began really with when a non-Congress government was established. First, in a hazy sort of way with Mr. Bajpai, and then in a more marked way under Mr. Modi.
Yeah, and Swapan, fascinating insights you give us, but I can't monopolize you completely. I have to request Adeel and Tripurdaman, you please have to join in. I'm sure you want to share your thoughts about your book with Swapan as well.
Yes, no, I mean, first, thank you so much for agreeing to release the book to the world. It's a great honor for us to be able to converse with you here. But I particularly like the point that you made about making a choice, especially when it came to the question of foreign policy, and particularly with China, on whether we were going to be the successor regime to the Raj. And that is definitely one thing that that comes into play. Another, I think, is also quite a strong sense of manifest destiny that Nehru seems to possess as leading the new Asian Renaissance. And at one point, he terms it as the big brother leading the younger brothers towards towards freedom and democracy. And I just wanted to ask whether there's what you thought of that sort of strand of Nehruvian thought that kind of also undergirded India's policy towards not just China but also towards all of Southeast Asia, and then vis-a-vis the US, because at some points he also that's one of the kind of sticking points with the US is he keeps there's a conscious effort to distance India from the US, mostly to evade Chinese criticism that actually Nehru is the running dog of imperialism, I think they call him. And I was wondering if you might say a few words on that.
I think it's true that there was this sort of sense of which Zhou Enlai resented, the sense of deep patronizing attitude which Nehru had, that I'm the big elder brother, and China has the legacy of being the middle kingdom. So you had these clash of civilizations or civilizational egos which actually took place to some extent there. Which was the other point which also comes through is that Nehru always looked upon America not merely as someone which is becoming a sort of a neo-colonial, neo-imperialist power. That certainly was a strand in his thinking. But if you look at Gopal's, I think it was the second volume of Gopal's biography of Nehru, and you look at how the early part of American foreign policy, in India's American policy was concerned, you'll find that in Nehru, there was a deep sort of cultural distaste of the brash American. I mean, this was, it's again, sort of Hampstead rejecting California, as it were. It was something which he found a sort of, it was almost aesthetic. He even wrote to Vijay Lakshmi Pandit, I don't recommend that we should send Indian students to America. They come back with all the wrong attitudes and wrong ideas and all that. He would never say that if they came to sort of the United Kingdom or any other part. And the final point which I want to mention here is that when it came to, Nehru basically abandoned the neighborhood. His point about the neighborhood was that it must fit into his larger anti-colonial wisdom, which resulted that India abdicated its considerable interests, for instance, in West Asia, all along what we today call as the Gulf states and, that part. India was the paramount power there till about the 50s. And India basically abdicated it for the sake of a third worldism, which was an idea minus a geography. So it was the geography which was abandoned. And I think it also was an excuse. It made some sort of, it was also what in Hindi they call majburi, because you sometimes lack the capacity to be able to enforce your sort of influence in certain parts of the world. So it's much better that you express solidarity with South Africa, with the people in South Africa, with Kenya, with the Mau Mau struggle there. Then you look for Nkrumah and Ghana, and of course Vietnam and Korea. So it was that where India really, and this silly attempt of Jawaharlal Nehru to be a player in the Korean War. I mean, it's also almost reminiscent of the time, if you may remember, when Rajiv Gandhi, during the first Gulf War, tried to, I think he hired a private plane and went off to Baghdad trying to broker peace. I mean, it's directly, it was very silly, but I think it was, there were shades of his grandfather there.
But before Adil just steps in, and maybe I just want to ask you this question, Swapan. This whole attempt of, say, the Congress party that, we are going to counter this so-called narrative against Nehru by actually reliving the legacy of Nehru is actually maybe not in sync with the times. I mean, his daughter began on a socialist so-called path, and then she understood midway that, that was just not the correct way to go because, where was the money coming in? You needed money, you needed foreign investments, you needed a private investment. The grandson, Rajiv Gandhi, also understood a little bit better. And this was what we were discussing, Swapan, before you joined us, is that liberalization, the corporate world is not a dirty word. That was something which was understood. But today, these attacks on, say, the corporate sector, is this an attempt to to make Nehru's legacy alive, to relive his legacy? And Adeel, if you can just join in on this grain of thought as well.
Should I jump in, or Swapan, do you want to go?
Yeah. So Swapan, I think
please,
he's going to answer you and he's going to answer me as well. Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, just to sort of zoom out again into this very specific. So essentially, Nehru looked at the world and he saw one big problem. That problem was capitalism. Everything was associated to it. So be it imperialism, be it all these other forms that are sort of, be it fascism, something that he saw while growing up and coming of age. And he found a solution very early on, like many upper class British men, in socialism. And the one thing that socialism could give him was solidarity with the poor and solidarity amongst the other elite fractions. And we see that, for instance, in the debate that he has with Muhammad Iqbal. So when he relives the moments and the encounters that he's had with him in The Discovery of India and other books that he writes, he always says that, Iqbal was also a socialist like I am, right? So there was some connection, and the connection was not that they were both Kashmiri, but the connection for Nehru was very strongly that they were both socialists, even though Iqbal was not, clearly not a socialist. And in fact, Nehru would have known that had he read the letters carefully that Iqbal posted to him. So even though both of them disagreed vehemently over the place of religion in politics and over what the real problem of the world was it an economic problem that required like an uplift, as Nehru would think, or was it a moral problem, like Iqbal thought, that required people to sort of turn more towards religion and be more compassionate to the suffering in the world? Regardless of where he came out, Nehru always stuck to this socialist solidarity that he then thought again on the international level when he turned towards China and he turned towards other countries, because those countries initially thought that independence was another trick of imperialism. So they thought the Indian independence wasn't a real thing. Partition violence wasn't was something that was engineered by the British in order to continue to continue capitalism and to continue ruling and exploiting parts of the what we now call the global South. So Nehru maybe would have tilted more towards the side of trying to prove that he's a real third world leader, may have gone a bit overboard, as both Tripurdaman and Swapan just said. But if we see him in that sort of greater legacy and we sort of try to reconstruct like his thought patterns, it's in a way also a rational position to take for him. So it's not something outrageous that he just stood there and said, like, now I'm going to swing entirely into this direction and become like this romantic complete romantic idealist who's like allowing China to take parts of what was many considered Indian territory. But there was like some type of there was a logic there that we try to sort of excavate in the book, and that one would find if one were to read the chapters carefully.
Swapan.
Well, firstly, I believe that there's one omission in this book, which you might correct in this next edition. I believe you should have had a conclusion where you've actually summed up the experience of all these controversies, whether Nehru's conflict with Iqbal on the role of religion, whether his disagreements with Jinnah about what the nature of Indian nationalism is supposed to be, the question of foreign policy with Patel, and again, with what might be seen as an incipient Indian conservatism, which grew up around Shama Prasad Mukherjee, which took another different turn. How do these strands tie up, particularly in the contemporary context? I think that's a thought which I can leave with you, and I'm sure this book will do very well. It's likely to, yes, Nehru's was not some sort of an impulsive reaction to anything. It was certainly a product of the times. There was a certain, just like planning, the 5-year plans, the Ghosh plan of the Soviet Union. These were things which inspired a certain generation. I mean, it was so inspirational that P.C. Mahalanobis, who devised the second 5-year plan, went on a visit to, I think, China or Vietnam. I can't remember which one. I think it was China, and came back wearing one of those big peasant hats, to show his measure of solidarity with the socialist things. And till a few years ago, even when I was a student in the 70s, something like the Great Leap Forward, which is now regarded in all conventional academia and for anybody who's studying China as an unmitigated disaster, that was looked upon as something great, So the idea of how austerity can lead you on to a greater form of industrialization, and you can fell all the kulaks in one blow. The mythology which grew around that sort of the fellow travelers of the Soviet Union, which they transplanted onto China, and they thought that, here's China, Mao. I mean, Sardar Panikar thought that Mao was a riveting intellect, which was an interesting point of view. It says more for Sardar Panikar than it says for Mao. But yes, these were considered decisions. I would say that no, Nehru was not impulsive. He was a product of the times. And I think to really understand Nehru, and I think some of the critiques of Nehru, some of the attacks on Nehru, which it made at this point, sometimes miss out on that facet, that what was the cultural, social background which actually created this Jawaharlal Nehru. And its origin does not, they believe that it was some sort of a infatuation with Lady Mountbatten which did it all. No, I don't think so. Certainly Nehru may have loved a weekend in the country houses of England, but I think it was a bit more, it was a little more complicated than that. But to understand Nehru, you've also got to understand contemporary English society. Basically, I'm saying that. And what was the fashion that? Because when he said he was the last Englishman to rule India, I don't think he was exaggerating. Maybe he was mocking himself for this, but I think he was also being honest. But I don't mean it in a pejorative sense. I'm just talking about a purely descriptive sort of way in which I think he was created. Like Jinnah. I believe that, Jinnah and Nehru, if there was a personality clash, Jinnah and Gandhi, I don't think Jinnah could even understand Gandhi. And he wasn't the only one. Most viceroys, is he a saint or is he a humbug? Lord Irwin. Most people just sort of exasperated with Gandhi. What the hell is this creature? But as far as Nehru was concerned, I think here we have two very different styles of Western, profoundly Western-oriented individuals trying to relate to each other. And Nehru thought that his was the only way. Jinnah thought Nehru doesn't see it. He's too much of a radical to see this. And I think there's a bit of psychohistory which has to be done. I mean, those exchanges of letters between Jinnah and Nehru are fascinating in the sense of the underlying brusqueness and the impatience which both of them have of each other. That impatience is something I found quite fascinating in every way. And when it, that's why when the last throw of the dice near the cabinet mission plan came, and Jinnah really jumped at one of Nehru's stray comments, and I think he was just also waiting for Nehru to really make that mistake or say something which was not prudent at that point to say. But so we have it. Mm-hmm. So it's. Yeah, go ahead.
But Swapan, we are also talking at a time where the younger generation, they may not know the details of these letter exchanges, or many of them might be looking at a political debate which refers to Nehru in a very pejorative way. If Nehru was to be alive today, you think he would have been shocked by what's happening around him and the kind of debate around him? Or would he be kind of a sense of comfort into, the way the things are? And plus, add on to this, my next question is the relevance of and redefining of Nehru. You think he's still, the fact that we are all discussing him, books are being written on him, a fascinating insight into Nehru and a debate which is defining India, therefore lies the importance and relevance of Jawaharlal Nehru.
Firstly, when you say about whether the younger generation, I'm the wrong person to ask. I think it's better that the authors of the book, I think they're chronologically have a greater proximity with the younger generation than I do. Secondly, I think every old man thinks that the generations after him have gone to see it. So that's a standard thing. I'm sure Nehru would have been profoundly disgusted. I think he would have got into a nervous convulsion after the fall of the Berlin Wall, when that world around him collapsed. And if he had seen Margaret Thatcher dismantling the what his great heroes of the day, Nye Bevan and all that, what they created, I mean, the world was never going to be the same for him. That was his world. So, I don't know what Nehru. And politics is never static. Nehru created a structure. Nehru certainly gave India a consensus and inheritance. Important it is. I think India is trying to move beyond it. In some cases, it is rejecting it outright. In some cases, it's adapting it in its own way. That doesn't undermine the importance of Jawaharlal Nehru. Neither does it make the fact that Nehru wrote this, therefore it must be true. That sort of Marx himself sort of approach. I don't think he saw himself as an ideologue. He had a sense of practical politics, and that practical politics was also dictated by the fact that the Congress was dominant in the country. It was overwhelmingly, it never had to really get nervous about electoral outcomes. Which is why at the first hint of a setback, which was 1962, his world collapsed. I mean, I think everyone, all the contemporaries testify the profound effect this had on Nehru personally. I mean, his world just fell apart totally. I mean, everything. So it was a minor shock. And looking back at it, it was a minor shock, which disoriented him so much. I wonder how he would have seen had the Congress been challenged electorally and being decimated in the polls and being reduced to a place where it doesn't even have the numbers to be a recognized leader of the opposition. These are. So I don't know how Nehru, maybe the youngster, maybe Adeel and Tripurdaman can sort of look upon it and say, how Nehru, whether he did deserve. I mean, to me, Nehru is a fascinating man, but what endures of Nehru in 2021? I say Nehru was a great stylist. He was an aesthete above all, and he was he heralded a certain style in Indian politics. That style it's over. It's over. That
we are getting
like
a
Nehru,
lot of interesting, Actually, we're getting a lot of interesting questions I can see on the screen. One which is very interesting, which I saw coming in from Sandeep Nadkarni. He says, by the late 50s, could he not course correct after he'd seen West Germany and Japan do well with capitalism? You think he should have been less stubborn about it and he perhaps should have done a course correction? That's what Sandeep is asking us, as he must be watching our show.
But
maybe I can just
thought of South Korea as lackeys. They thought of countries like South Korea. They were looked upon with contempt by people like Nehru. He was looking at North Korea. That's the problem. Depends where your gaze is. I mean, and they were surrounded by these fellow travelers in India. The strength of what might loosely be called the Soviet lobby, the so-called progressives in India, the progressives who were fighting against the dhotiwalas. That was the cultural fault line in India. And Nehru naturally he wasn't thinking of course correcting. He was thinking of the great, the new temples of modern India. Read his speech at the inauguration of the Punjab High Court in Chandigarh, when he says, I'm so glad Le Corbusier actually devolved the architecture which had nothing to do with the surroundings. Because if we look at the surroundings, that's backward. So here he was, a new modernism transplanted into the soil of Hindustan, and that was Jawaharlal Nehru. And the public sector, the steel foundries, that was, if he had a model, it was state capitalism. And that state capitalism was really, as we now know, based on a lot of questionable statistics and based on an underlying discontent which came to the fore. So no, I don't think Nehru would have considered a reversal. And, he had a great sense of his own infallibility.
Adeel, you wanted to say something because we're just going to start.
Yeah, I mean, just very quickly on the same issue. I mean, Nehru saw the world unfolding into a specific form of historicism, that comes with socialism, and therefore he would have seen places like Germany, who had like the economic wonder, the Wirtschaftswunder, as they say in German. He would have seen that with as a temporary high, which would lead to something as fascism, right? So which would lead to a bigger form of destruction. And for him, simply a country having like this brief moment of great economic upswing wasn't really something that would have swayed him to suddenly give up his long-honed ideological foundation and then, throw in his lot, because there was an economic upswing as well in the decades preceding fascism and the entire destruction of the world, as we saw in the 2 world wars. So that wouldn't have been like a reason for him to be swayed, because he came of an age where all of these things had already played out, and they had played out in a catastrophic way.
Yeah, if I can quickly just intervene as well. I think there is, through Nehru's letters, there's a constant references to war or the idea that war, seems to be coming, and he whether he's speaking on Parliament on fundamental rights, whether he's writing to Patel on China, whether he's talking about even religion, there's a constant undertone where he expects at any moment for things to fall apart and for some form of warfare to erupt. So he expects Korea, of course, to lead to a new world war, but he also expects, and he says it very openly, China won't do anything to us, because if they do anything to us, well, then we will have a world war. So one of the reasons that he doesn't have for course correction is he believes that no real course correction is necessary, since socialist internationalism is already it's kind of de facto connected to peace, because if you're not socialist, then you're by default you're expansionist. He says this to the Indian representative in Tibet, then Hugh Richardson, and he says, he's the fault of the problems in Tibet are the fault of our representative, because he is encouraging the Tibetans, and that would lead to war. So I think Adeel's kind of hit a very, very crucial point, is that at any moment he expects things to devolve into war, and any war to really lead to world war.
Okay, we do have a lot of reactions coming in, but all of this is also going to be put up on our social media timeline. So guys, please, the questions we've not been able to answer, I think Swapan will happily, and Adeel and Tripurdaman will happily answer this online. But once again, Adeel and Tripurdaman, all the best. I'm sure this book is going to do very well. It's timely, and as Swapan pointed out, it also provokes a kind of a debate and a discussion. And Swapan, as always, what do I say? It's always wonderful chatting with you. You have so much of insight, so much of masala, and it was really great chatting up with both of you. And thank you very much for joining us this evening and morning, I guess, in London.